So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Milja Gluhovic, and this is the last seminar in the series that's called Cultures of the Left in the Time of the Pandemics that we started in collaboration with colleagues from JNU and CUNY. This one is entitled Cultures of the Left and the Pandemics and Issues of Race. And we have four guests today. Hopefully the fourth one will join us. So I will introduce Angela Marino later on if she joins us. And then the first speaker next in line is Simovahan Valuvian. Please correct me if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly.
That's fine.
He is an assistant professor in Department of Sociology at the University of Warwick, and his ongoing research areas focus on the rise of contemporary nationalism that traverses a range of ideological and cultural repertories, which culminated in a monograph from 2019 that's entitled The Clamor of Nationalism. After Valu, we have Naz Rashid, who is a lecturer at the University of Sussex, where she teaches on media and cultural studies. Her monograph, entitled Veiled Threats, representing the Muslim women in public policy discourses, was published 2016 by Bristol University Press. And her research interests also include race, gender, religion, and urban studies and social policy. And finally, we have with us Olivera Jakic, who is also hosting us. She teaches at CUNY, New York, and Olivera is associate professor there at John Jay College. Her publications have focused on texts treated as documentation of 18th century British colonialism, on the constitution of archives of gender, and on the related histories of writing about historical subjects and literary characters. And I'll just mention her most recent editorial work, Archives and Popular Culture, special issue of Journal of Popular Culture from 2020, and Archive in Popular Culture, special issue of Archives and Records, also for 2020, and Justice e-reader, where she's on editorial board since 2018. So as Val noticed earlier, the brief for this session is quite broad. Our reflections on the issues of race have evolved since our first seminar that happened on the 1st of May, when we kind of spontaneously got together and started reflecting on the changing world in the context of the pandemics. And issues that we kind of were touching on was early on the ways in which, you know, racial minorities in the West in particular were differentially affected by the COVID crisis, and then later on, you know, it expanded the rest of the world. The Black Lives Matter movement and events that evolved around the killing of George Brown. Then issues of higher education. There was a whole session dedicated to that, and online pedagogies and slow university, and pro and cons digital delivery of classes, and kind of inequalities in that area. And finally, issues around the colonizer curriculum, which I think are an ongoing staple in these conversations today, that were catalyzed by the Black Lives Matter movement. I think our speakers will come from different with different obviously points of view, but also with different issues to raise, and that's fine. And in some ways, these conversations were grounded in the discipline of theater and performance studies, but they were also always very interdisciplinary. And we had colleagues from politics, sociology, languages, and gender studies. So it's an open dialogue and interdisciplinary dialogue. Um, so without further ado, I think it would be good if Walu kicks us off. We said 5 minutes. It's fine if you spill over.
Sure thing.
Say what you have to say for the kind of first round, and then everybody is welcome to participate, ask questions, and to have a dialogue. And thank you again all for kind of agreeing to take part in this, and all of you listening and participating, and to Olivera for hosting us.
So yeah, thank you, Miliha, for having me. I know the brief is very broad, but I dare say I still managed to misunderstand it somehow. So I think I assumed that it was most explicitly concerned with the theme of decolonization as regards the racism and university sector. I think it's just because I had a scan of certain readings, and perhaps I was just slightly mispitched this. But of course, as the discussion progresses, I myself write a lot on racism, nationalisms, and of course, COVID-19 as a very important inflection or intensification of some of those themes. But I think I will just stick to a little bit about around the decolonial remit, should any of that be interesting. I note that I don't actually usually speak on these more university-oriented themes because I'm sometimes wary of we perhaps center our own concerns a little excessively. But so what I will say herein is kind of deliberately tangential, insofar as I won't necessarily foreground the more obvious parameters of racism and imperialist legacies in the British university setting. I will instead try to just speculatively highlight a couple, perhaps relatively neglected or important features of what makes the decolonial demand, uh, of course, important, but also complex. Um, so firstly, actually, as was hinted at in some of the reading material circulated, certainly the psychobabble piece and certainly the prison abolition piece, many do remain rightly cautious about the increasingly prominent emphasis is on representation and identity in putatively anti-racist politics. It is, I think, rightly intimated that such an emphasis risks absolving the particularly violent structural practices the British university is today most answerable for. And I know Naz Rashid will be able to speak to this perhaps, but as regards, for instance, the prevent duty guidance, which institutionalizes Muslims as a proverbially suspect community, the tier 4 attendance, the visa regimes that converts university staff into what is essentially an extension of the state's bordering arm, how the underpaid but nevertheless overexploited administrative and auxiliary staff often constitute the most preponderant migrant and non-white presence on campus, but also how extortionate global South come international student fees actually subsidize the sector and rather more discomfortably subsidize our own salaries. And when framed in these terms, it becomes indeed apparent that a currently prominent individualized focus on white privilege or formal faculty representation is only partly or obliquely relevant to these wider exploitations and exclusions. Um, Secondly, as regards decolonization from an explicitly curriculum perspective, of course, in many ways, it is a simple demand to merely diversify content and also to more critically contextualize past canons. But I think the more inventive element from an analytic perspective has been the demand to actually begin to reckon with the shifting terms of global influence and capital flow, not least the rise of East Asian and other emergent hubs or nodes of global power. Um, British curriculums, even when construed as critical or radical in a slightly often self-satisfied righteous way, remain largely unresponsive to these shifting contexts. If we take seriously the task of quote unquote provincializing Europe, then there is a need to more sharply grapple with the condition of slow but not so managed decline that the West and certainly contemporary Britain and the Anglo-American sphere is currently undergoing. And as Achille Mbembe put it so well, the central socio-historical fact of the present conjuncture is the demise of Europe. This being a condition which provokes, of course, pathologically revengist and pathologically melancholic politics of white nationalisms, which of course is what I happen to write about. So please buy the book, good people. But it also clarifies the lapsing of the centrality of Europe in determining the world's ways. And, as I am often queried, actually, when I go, I happen to be from Sri Lanka, and when I go back there and I talk, I'm often queried about my presumed references. I'm often queried about, when I'm speaking there, about how both whiteness and Western capital, respectively, are not always the most obvious references through which to situate their contemporary struggles. Firstly, they're quick to point out that the forms of majoritarian chauvinism, so presently ascendant, are rooted through domestic and regional nation-making normativities, though inherited, of course, from a colonial nation-state modernity. Secondly, I'm routinely reminded or challenged that, it is actually Chinese, but wider regional capital, not least the Gulf petrostates, that are such a key destination for migrant labor, which constitutes increasingly such an important and significant axis of neglect, disposability, and exploitation that many contemporary Sri Lankans reckon with. So it is this more global sense of capitalisms and communitarianisms as it relates to what the late Stuart Hall called the fateful triangle of race, ethnicity, and nation, that I believe, in any case, a critically decolonial analytic program agitates for. Furthermore, this radical reworking of what we understand to be a more globally, let's say, post-colonial curriculum will also better cater to the very student cohorts that we teach, at least from within Britain and certainly from Warwick, which are eminently international and often eminently global South. And I'm always struck by how reluctant we in British sociology, at least, have been to incorporate, let's say, the Chinese or the Indian or the Nigerian context into our curriculum, and crucially on its own terms. So, and actually on a quick aside, I'm also struck there is a kind of left liberal intimation at times in kind of passing conversations that these are actually just oligarchic, kind of rich elite student base that are not, who are not owed the same allowances as regards kind of curriculum shifts and sensitivities. And not only is this incredibly naive, but bad sociology in terms of who these classes actually are, in terms of who the student cohort comprises, but it's also just too convenient. It's a convenient elision that allows us to remain in certain comfort zones about our principal empirical references. So I think what I mean there is that, what I want to suggest there is that sometimes bringing through an anti-racist awareness still stays all too conveniently within certain comfort zones, contradictory in part to our purported aims. I don't know if I've exhausted my time. I just have one final passing point, and then that will suffice, I reckon. It's really rather a oblique observation, but I want to raise a perhaps slightly more personal matter as regards how researchers of non-white backgrounds are admitted entry to the academy, and at least in Britain. And here I often fear that the roles we access are already racially designated by schemas of authenticity and identity. And this harkens, to a longer tradition of racist representation, where the expressions that racialized people or racialized as non-white people were seen to, the expressions they were seen to be capable of were predominantly construed as somehow being just intuitive knowledge or cultural knowledge or community knowledge, a certain kind of insider authenticity, and very little to do with intellectual industry or application. And the problem is actually revealed when by the incredulity, really, the incredulity that Black and other non-white academics often encounter when commenting on social processes putatively beyond those to which they are racially designated. Instead, there is an understanding that we are only race scholars. I will never be an apologist for wanting to talk about race, but it's also kind of a frame that is convenient for the academy to kind of trap or tie us within. and we're kind of contained within that silo, irrespective of whatever our wider expertise or theoretical interest might be. On a quick aside, I happen to teach post-colonial theory and such like, but I also teach classical theory in the department at the moment. Classical meaning a euphemism for 19th century the European canon, but. So I do fear often, at least in my experience and some of my peers, there's a certain kind of patronizing Orientalism that often prevails, which we too are sometimes too happy to accommodate, wherein one is admitted entry, but only as people who authentically speak to a certain identity, a certain experience, and nothing much else. And it is this legacy too that I hope in any case, the decolonial demand is militating against. Now I'm sure I've overshot my time, so I'll just desist there. Thank you very much.
That's absolutely fine. Thank you very much, Valu. Naz, would you like to speak next?
Yes, I will speak next. So Valu is always a very hard person to speak after because he's so eloquent, and I'm going to do all the things he accused the Anglo-American Academy of doing by speaking from a very parochial perspective of being an academic based in the UK. But I did want to start by saying, thank you for inviting me, and it's so, I'm really looking forward to kind of the wider conversation, and it's great to see my comrades and colleagues from JNU, where I was like in September last year, and it just seems such a long time ago now. But basically, I took you on your word in terms of the pitch for what we were going to do. So these are genuinely just reflections, but they reflect my role as a scholar of race, someone who also works on issues of race equality within the academy. So looking at the awarding gap between white and Black and ethnic minority students, but also at a university which, like Warwick, Sussex has a very high intake of international students. And obviously my perspective is coming from someone with heritage from the global south, but based in the global north. So in terms of the three main points that I wanted to make, the first was really just reflecting on the start of the pandemic, and obviously the kind of the racialization of the disease itself. And I'm sure you covered a lot of these in your previous sessions, which I'm unfortunately didn't get around to listening. So I hope it's not too repetitive. But yeah, the racialization of COVID itself, the origins in China, how that then kind of played out in the representation, rather offensive languages, Kung Flu, and then also the sort of Orientalist narratives about sort of the barbarism of wet markets as opposed to sort of industrialized meat farming in the West. But as someone working in a university as the pandemic began, with a high proportion of international students, many of whom were from East Asia, the direct experiences of racism that they were targeted with, as well as colleagues of East Asian heritage as well, that was something that was really quite stark. At the time, I was teaching a module on culture, race, and ethnicity, and talking about the way that ideas of race are kind of socially constructed. And it was great teaching material, but also obviously very sort of painful as well for a lot of my students, who were being visibly targeted for wearing masks, before it was seen as kind of something that might actually abate the pandemic. They were being targeted for that. But equally as well at that time, certainly in London and other parts of the UK, it was sort of the Chinatowns, which were experiencing sort of forms of unofficial lockdowns, as these places became seen as sort of no-go areas. So that was the kind of first point I wanted to make about the sort of beginnings of the pandemic. In terms of the second point about the experience of the pandemic, and speaking as somebody working in HE, trying to deliver teaching, planning for remote teaching next term, the whole kind of issue of accessibility by students, their ability to be able to engage with all these the new technologies and access to laptops, these are things that we just assume in planning for remote teaching, but this is obviously not guaranteed. And in this short time, you see the big contrast between different students, and obviously that overlaps pre-existing axes of marginalization such as race or class, and even also citizenship status as well. And obviously, the point that you've already raised, that's behind this, the evidence about ethnicity as a factor, and also the intersecting variables with ethnicity, and they also need to be kind of considered together. Which brings me to, as someone who's somebody who studies race and who teaches around race, you know, how has what is the impact of COVID, or how have I kind of seen the way that the COVID pandemic has kind of panned out? And so, as well as the sort of racialization of the disease in terms of its association with China, also thinking about how the sort of narratives around the not just the causes, but also the sort of incidence and the kind of impact of it. You know, we can see the kind of the eugenicist and racial science framings of the disease, you know, whereby it's kind of essentialized and based on sort of biological understandings of race, and people being naturally seen as being predisposed to it, whether that's, you know, vitamin D, etc. Secondly, though, the sort of culturalist interpretation, which again is often, you know, we talk about cultural racism, that certain communities who engage in intergenerational living, attendance at religious gatherings, that these kinds of are the sort of absolute causes for the greater incidence of of COVID amongst these populations. So in that sense, then, the kind of narratives around COVID reflect these kind of existing biological and culturalist interpretations of racism. And obviously, as Valu also alluded to, you know, none of this kind of actually takes into account sort of wider context of history, politics, structures and systems of the state, whether that's national or international, or even very, very local. You know, obviously one of the key issues is, in terms of the incidence, is occupational risk, and that doesn't necessarily always follow a kind of class line, but obviously there are some professions more affected than others, whether that's a precariously employed Uber driver, cleaner or care worker. But also we can think of things like housing and health inequalities. And I'm sure, you know, you've already discussed this, the way that existing inequalities have been highlighted and exacerbated. So I've been involved in some research into housing policies in the 1980s in the East End of London, and the way that East London Bangladeshi communities kind of experienced racism and housing policies in the 1980s. You know, they were given the worst housing, overcrowded circumstances, and part of, you know, almost ghettoized. And, you know, what is the long-term kind of impact of that? In the UK context, British Bangladeshis are twice as likely to die from COVID-19. So, you know, what is the legacy of that historic housing policy into current kind of housing and health inequalities? And then, so the question that I alluded to earlier, the idea that it's intergenerational living that's kind of causal, well, how does that housing, how has that impacted on the need for intergenerational living? Is that cultural choice, or is that an economic necessity? And again, touching on some of the things that Vala was saying, we take things like the immigration regime in the UK and the hostile environment, which meant that workers in garment factories in Leicester in the Midlands, they were forced to keep working because of their immigration status, which meant that they had no recourse to public funds. So all of the packages that were made available to people to protect them were not accessible by people because of their citizenship status. Likewise, even within the university, I think earlier this week I heard at the University of East London that students were being deported because university closures meant that they weren't able to extend their visas. So, you know, this wider structural kind of global system kind of having very micro impacts on particular groups of people who are already marginalized. And then, of course, there's the issue of policing of the lockdown, and you know, how has that played out? And no surprise there that it's been certain groups of people who have been disproportionately policed. So in the UK context, young Black people, and obviously then, you know, we've talked about the sort of the impact of the Black Lives Matter protests and how that's kind of catalyzed and galvanized a lot of activism. But obviously, you know, that was also demonized as something that would cause kind of the wider spread amongst a vulnerable group of people. And while the Black Lives Matter movement has been energizing and important, I'm kind of been thinking about how do these two things interact. So the kind of response to COVID and the kind of racial inequalities highlighted by that, and then some of the way that the Black Lives Matter movement is being mediated in policy discourse and also the media. And so, yeah, I'm just kind of, when we have a conversation about this, I'd be interested to see what people think about that, whether they are the kind of two responses, the response to COVID and Black Lives Matter, are they aligned? Are they reinforcing, or are they fracturing? You know, but the worst case scenario is clearly that the aftermath of the pandemic is going to be so devastating economically and politically that some of the moment that's offered, you know, from this movement, will that moment be gone? So I'm going to leave it there on quite a sort of rhetoric, maybe not rhetorical question, a question that we can come back to, hopefully.
Thank you very much, Naz. And Olivera, you're muted.
Sorry. Yes, Angela's not here, so I'm the last speaker, correct? Now you're muted. I was also just going to offer some reflections that actually build on what Naz was just saying, and definitely in a very sort of US and even more specifically New York context, because New York went from the sort of epicenter of the US pandemic spread to actually, statistically speaking, a fairly decent place to be, in which businesses are starting to reopen. But I thought in the context of the past 15 or 20 years of US social history and what's happening with the health systems in the United States, this is an interesting moment to look at both the rhetoric of race as it exists in the city of New York, but also as the city of New York as a reflection on a broader sort of US and global rhetoric around race as a historical and political category. I'm going to share my screen for a second because I wanted to remind everyone who wasn't here in the past 15 years of an interesting moment from 2005 and 2006. And this is actually from originally from 2005, there was a moment in which the Federal Drug Administration approved a drug called Bidil that was approved very explicitly for the use by African Americans. And it was very kind of vague what the argument was for the medication to be working in a different way on the hearts of people of color. So there was a lot of public discussion. And of course, this was a commercial pharmaceutical product, and a lot of the arguments for its viability were made in terms of commercial success, so that the commercial success was sort of biologized, and the heart disease and the history of proclivity among African Americans. And the statistics about this are sort of pretty clear that African Americans have heart disease at higher rates than people designated or self-designated as white in the United States. But the other interesting thing was that there was an actual public discussion. I was just going to show you another thing. There is sort of discussion of this in medical literature, in professional journals of the American Medical Association and in Annals of Family Medicine. And there's a long history of understanding that there's something about race in the United States that cannot be read from statistical data. Can you still see my screen? So there's also a history of discussions about how the pain in persons of color is treated as different kind of pain when it's physical pain, and that amidst the sort of epidemic of addiction to pain medication, which in some relatively recent reports is rampant in the United States. The places where it's rampant is, the places are usually the locations, geographies in which white working class people are dominant. So I just wanted to point out how the public discussion these days of the sort of numbers concerning the pandemic of COVID-19 are actually shifting, because the numbers, once they were actually accounting for the racial difference, started to show that, especially in New York, the rates of death in New York from COVID-19, notwithstanding all the dubious origins of the math that goes into these statistics, they were showing how people of color, both Hispanic and African American, were dying at rates that were twice or three times what the rates were for white Americans and white New Yorkers. And along the lines of what Naz was mentioning earlier, a lot of these conversations had to do with the way that housing policy, and public housing in particular, is treated as a political issue. And of course, most of the most recent immigrants are people of color, and the kinds of immigrants that have replaced the European immigrants in the mid-20th century. So all the discussion about race now, and race and COVID-19 is beginning to get a more sort of interesting dimension when the histories of stress and histories of sort of traumatic historical exposure to life of discrimination and oppression are taken into account. So it looks like something about the public discourse is changing. The interesting thing with statistics and law these days, literally this week, have to do with how the federal government, sort of the Trump administration, has prohibited hospitals from reporting their actual numbers to the Centers for Disease Control. So it might be possible that we just won't have any numbers on which to make any conclusions of this sort. And there was also an attempt on the part of the federal government to ban international students from entering the United States or from staying in the United States if the instruction at universities is all online. Since most universities are preparing to be all online because there are no conditions for testing, tracing, any of that, it meant that a great number of students who have been in the United States for years would have to leave to completely uncertain and unknown conditions. So it was an effort. I think the first lawsuits came from Harvard and MIT, of course, because they could afford it. But several universities filed a lawsuit against the federal government, and it looks like the federal government has desisted now from implementing that decision. So the rhetoric and the public discourse about race is shifting sort of as we speak. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see how the pandemic of COVID-19 has instrumentalized some of the old sort of power instruments, and how the new situation in which mass evictions are probably days from now in New York on August 1st, the protections from the government for people who could not afford to pay rent expire, and evictions are already starting. So I think the new race-related, even if not admittedly so, crisis is going to be the crisis of mass evictions from public and other housing. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Olivera. I don't think that Angela Marino has joined us, so I think we will just move into discussion. I'm opening the floor for everybody. Well, first perhaps to give you guys a chance to respond if you want to respond to any of your comments, and then open it up for everybody else.
Yeah.
Go on, Valu.
Right. No, I thought Naj and Olivera really complement each other very well. I thought there was something Naj said that I think actually really interesting on the theme of what the place of China here. And in terms of my own research interests, I've been for the most part writing on the consolidation of nationalist politics across Western Europe and Britain in particular. And what's interesting is that the public health imperatives of COVID-19 has, according to many, and I think rightly or understandably, slightly disrupted the populist nationalist frames and hasn't allowed for the same traction that the current right is accustomed to enjoying. But what I think Naj alludes to indirectly, and a theme that I'm quite fond of, is I think the place of China is emerging as the kind of conjunctural specter that was long overdue. And in some ways, the nationalist frames that were so prominent in Western Europe will recover, revitalize that voice once it can adapt to a pandemic's gaze. And that pandemic's gaze, I think necessarily will have to call upon China in a very pointed way. You know, given its economic and political threat, it's going to be figured as really prominent viral pariahs, drawing on all those colonial lines of racial peril and Sino-menace. But just the sheer wider purpose of checking the increased clout of China's market position had already been previewed by the tariff and technology wars spearheaded by Trump. But Naj and I, who are in Britain, I think the most significant news event this last week in the British news cycle has been the Huawei rulings. And it is actually, I think James Medway put it really well. I think some of us are quite naive about the kind of reheated Cold War framework through which another nationalism is going to find its footing here. Of course, a lot of you in India and you are experiencing a very different inflection and variation on that. And I don't purport to speak from that vantage point. But the COVID theme frothing about China, some even mooting a contorted indemnity case, does suggest that the Anglo-American reckoning is a terminology that they've been using with the power of Chinese capitalism is finally finding its contingencies. And I would say from a distinctly British perspective, that anti-EU or the European Union delirium was actually the quixotic chimera that stood in for the wider rise of China. It was like the misdirected symptom, and where the increased experience of diminished authority in the global flow of accumulation yields this revanchist politics against East Asian influence and compounded by white entitlement and grievance. But of course, this specter is going to give 21st century nationalism this incredible civilizational reference and scope. But of course, as Naj also says, it will have its violent street level proxies. All of those identified as being East Asian or conflated as Chinese, and the kind of daily street racisms that this will also reheat in a way that I think race scholarship in Britain has been fairly neglectful about over the last 20 years. Sorry, that was quite long-winded. Yeah, I'm done, yeah.
Thank you, Val. I'm more used to Teams, so I'm trying to remember. Please feel free to raise your hand, and I don't know if there is a hand function here as well.
There is. If you
clapping.
Yeah, there's, if you go where, hold on.
Reactions. Is it reactions at the bottom? So you can either, oh no, you can clap or put your hand up.
There was a different thing. Hold on.
Oh, if you go to participants,
Participants.
then it says raise hand. So I've just
There
done
are
it
some
there.
participants.
Yeah.
So Veronica has raised a thumb. So I'm not sure if that means she would like to speak or just to give us a
To practice raising her hand.
I wanted to show you that it exists. That's all. I find it very interesting and I would like you to talk because it's absolutely fascinating.
Still,
Sorry.
Millie, are you going to say something?
No, I thought you were going to say something.
Oh, me. No, I was just trying to look at stuff and participants, and I don't see the hand.
Yeah, lots of people just don't have cameras on, so I guess the only way
Okay.
to participate would be to press.
I think Bishnu Priya has put her hand up.
Okay.
Sorry, Pia, I didn't. Oh, I can see it now in the left corner. It's very different from Teams. Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, you know, I think this is what, you know, I was just mentioning that race is a universal category, but it also has very specific connotations historically. And, you know, for example, when the Indian Constitution came up, because of the whole, you know, sort of celebrating the freedom from Britain, a race was never featured. You know, it was as if the racial questions has been taken care of, but it's always been there underlying. So, you know, and also in relation to China, because, you know, India has also had very sort of a very racist attitude and outlook towards China. I remember during the India-China war, the Chinese used to be called as yellow pigs. You know, it was such a big scandal. So I'm wondering, when we're talking about, you know, anti-racism, and with such different specificities, so different, you know, locational histories, how do we approach it? Or are they, you know, are there not going to be any networking in the anti-racist positions we take? Or is it just going to be, you know, something very universal? That is really the question.
Okay, let's ponder on that question while I'm introducing Angela Marino. I'm delighted that she's been able to join us, or Angela rather. So I'll just say a few words and big hello for everybody. We started, so Angela is author, well, she's first associate professor in the Department of Theater, Dance and Performance Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, and author of a book that's entitled Populism and Performance in the Bolivarian Revolution, published by Northwestern University Press in 2018. Also edited Festive Devils in the Americas by Chicago Press 2015. She's associate director of the Latinx Research Center and is advisor to the Teatro Lab project, an ensemble course of community engaged popular theater. So Angela, welcome. And I'm just wondering if you wanted to give us, you know, your presentation, if you had something to share initially, and then just kind of rejoin the conversation. You are muted.
Well, first of all, my apologies if I'm late. I have 8 a.m. I'm up and with my coffee. I'm ready for this conversation. I'm really excited to be here. I could certainly go into the presentation. I would. Did I miss the introductions of others?
Yes. Did I get your time zone wrong?
Oh, I don't. Well, I have
Wrong.
8 a.m. for our timing. Have you already been in an hour of conversation?
No, half an hour.
Oh, half an hour?
Well,
Okay.
an hour actually.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, we were at 10 Eastern. So
I had 8 a.m. on my call for
So I must have
I
calculated
am
time zones wrong.
terribly sorry, and
Apologies.
but I guess it's been recorded, so I can go back and listen to it. I'd be happy to give the presentation if now's the time to do it.
Yes, please.
Great. So so thank you again for the opportunity to be here. I wanted to first say that I'm speaking from occupied Miwok and Ohlone territory here in Central California. I appreciate so much the invitation to be here to be able to talk with you about these issues. Of course, we are in the middle of it, but in the middle of it means everywhere. And it's part of what's so exciting, I think, about being here in COVID in this moment. It's bringing all kinds of these struggles to the fore. It's unifying us with renewed energy. Foremost, it's about Black power here. This is unified Black, Brown, Indigenous power. So I wanted to open with a quote from Glenn Ford, who is one of the leading Black intellectuals in the country and editor of the Black Agenda Report, where he says, "An existential political crisis for the racial capitalist order will only happen when the left puts forward a viable political alternative. We are seeking the return of the party, I think, Black futures, and necessarily taking down carceral capitalism." So I think what we're producing here as theater makers must envision these alternatives and be a laboratory for these political alternatives. COVID, at the same time, it seems to be hastening these dystopian futures. It's following the pattern of capitalism and sudden enclosures. We jump to sealed spaces, biospheric bubbles, online shopping, distance learning, perhaps a recall of gestures that at once can be liberatory for some, but at the same time, enforcing the role of spectator with its distance effects. That's reminding me of the bourgeois sensibility that Nicholas Rideout was writing about in his recent book called Scenes from Bourgeois Life. What the non-gender binary leadership of Black Lives Matter has brought forth in this moment is an alternative, sorting out the monumental memory of who our heroes are in the present day and who they are not. Some are getting closer back to the land, finding neighbors and extending kin, ways to deepen trust circles, finding home sustenance and gardening, farming at a more intensive level. Others are intensifying their commitment to be on the street, to act on petitions, to build up infrastructure with organizations and with renewed militancy. Some are doing both, bunkering down in ways that are building up new homegrown and communal possibilities, especially as the police state plays its hand in COVID to ratchet up the violence to the demands for justice and leave us no alternative with the Democratic Party for any real change. We need to make a new road. Last semester, I taught a class on race and performance that was bookended by plays that took on these kind of two different approaches. We started with a play that was called Chasing Meserly by Chinaka Hodge that features a young Black protagonist named Watts, who's seeking his liberation, hits the streets in pursuit of the police officer that killed Oscar Grant on Fruitvale Station. So he's hitting the streets, coming out of the house on the streets and active, and creating new community in that effort. We ended with a play called Mother Road by Octavio Solis about the Mexican descendants of the Joad family, if you're familiar with the Grapes of Wrath and the kind of westward journey of the Joad family in mid-century, and his Black and brown queer allies, that this is the descendants of the Joad family, that take a road trip against the setting sun back to Oklahoma, to the heartland to restore the family farm. So throughout, we read other plays in this class. We studied race and American history, The Forging of Whiteness, Manifest Destiny, the genocidal occupation of this North America that we call Turtle Island, And we discussed the edifice of the culture industry in the United States, redlining, CIA funding of film and media, COINTELPRO, culminating in our own theater production of a play called Who Shot Miguelito, on the displacement of inner city Black and Latinx families by gentrification. When the class entered its final weeks, I sat back and I was satisfied. We had covered what we call performance and cultures, right from this construction of race, coloniality, and ultimately imperialism at a DNA level. And that performance would, of course, be inseparable from its undoing. Yet, when looking over the final essays and how several of them argued for the increasing the visibility of Black or Asian actors, decrying the all-white judges of the Academy Awards, or arguing whether Glee's version of West Side Story had failed, rest in peace for Rivera. I don't know if you know Naya Rivera, who is an actor who recently passed away. And ultimately imperialism, I'm sorry, excuse me. So, and ultimately these problems, these structural problems and issues, it seemed that the problems were much more easily apprehended as issues of identity, as if we all simply wanted to have more access to the same imperial project instead of changing it altogether. So I'm realizing like the solutions to these structural problems, the new systems that we ultimately might collectively uphold are far less easy to grasp. And many of our students sought reform through this kind of cultural time on stage, or at best democratization in the spotlight, instead of taking up the deeper work of what it will take to dissemble and remake what it means to be visible in relation to the power structure at all. So the problem isn't visibility of Blackness in America necessarily. The problem is that that visibility, including that of lynchings, has been in service to US capitalist violence. So back to the drawing board, back to the classroom, we decided to share with 100 people in the room over 2 days to discuss their projects in an open forum, which was another huge risk. What emerged was the dialectic, where reinforcing and modeling a direct democratic method to experience 1-minute sharebacks had the effect of a kind of TikTok politics, where projects like these kept building for me an immense hope for these populist strategies. Some were hard hitting, others just funny, others we might swipe by. But in the end, I'm reminded to not underestimate the power of seeing each other in these moments. And yet, without these visionary futures, we risk shortening revolution for a handful of reversible reforms. As Glenn Ford said, there is no political crisis for the ruling order unless ending their rule is on the agenda of significant social forces. From prisons, on the streets, and the front lines of this academic epidemic, it seems to me that we have a short window of time to present these alternatives, even though it may take many lives over to see them through. Right now, we simply cannot let the state reorganize in its current form. And so my point in closing becomes another question. How might we, as performance studies scholars and practitioners, to build Black and Indigenous power, to support the visionary work of New World making in this moment, and to create exciting forums for and rewarding methods for structural liberation that are also at once feminist and planetary visions of living in harmony with the earth and towards each other. Towards this, and of course it's not a complete answer, but we must continue to produce, to promote, experiment, and reflect from kitchen tables to the streets with fearless imagination. So that's the presentation or thoughts or reflections I had that I wanted to share. I put together some slides, but I didn't want to take any more moments to jump over to them unless I knew that we had them, but I'm excited to hear what you all have to say about these issues and how it's
Thank you so much, Angela, and big apologies again for mixing time zones. So you missed the first 45 minutes. Valo in particular addressed the issue of decolonizing curriculum in broadest terms. And kind of his presentation, he kicked us off. Chance with yours most, I would say. But I guess the issues that you raised in relation to theater and performance studies resonate for, other disciplines as well. And I guess maybe one issue we might want to kind of think through some more here, because there are people from different disciplines here and it's been an interdisciplinary dialogue. How to do this in the context of our particular disciplines. Are these methods or ways of going about this different? You have at your disposal plasticity of performance and theater collectives and communities, and so what are the ways of reaching out? Who do we reach out? It's not meant to be, I guess, just purely disciplinary classroom dialogue, right? So what are these vectors of engagement is, I guess, a big question. Because some have rightfully said that it's not enough just to put some post-colonial theorists on your curriculum or, place performances from other cultures. I mean, yes, it is important to internationalize curriculum, and that's been a big conversation in our discipline. And, from those dialogues was a theater journal about performance studies colonial and all of that Janelle Reynolds started some times ago with a few other scholars up to this moment, right? But it would be, not to exclude others. I think it would be good to have other voices and what this means for their disciplines in particular. If this is the conversation we want to have, but it could be any other things. Anybody from the audience who would like to jump in? Or speakers?
Well, I think that opening, the classroom is absolutely an imperative. We have to consider what goes on in the classroom as a space that people can work out what these issues are that are being raised from the streets and in the workplaces and on these front lines. If we become absorbed within old material that's not relevant for the current moment, we're simply wasting time. And yet old material can be extremely relevant for the current moment. It's just a matter of how is it framed and who is it serving. So I think that's part of our planning and our way of going about the classroom, and also making sure that students are directly engaged with what's happening in these movements in the current moment. I was really curious about this time warp of responsibility in the way that Schneider put it in our common readings that we had for this. How do we create that time together? And what does it take for us to be together in that way, to shorten time together and understand that urgency? That becomes a very powerful, powerful force. To be able to respond together. And I think we can organize those kinds of things in the classroom and begin to create messaging and build up the stronger movement for that kind of structural change from it. What's clear to me is that as a force on the streets, it's much more powerful than forces alone. And it's clear to me that when we are organized around philosophy, ideas that take us past policy that can end up drowned into a lot of reformist and ultimately ineffective forms of change. It will leave the power structure intact. And I think we have an opportunity now to do something much more important than that.
Yeah, but I agree with everything that you said, but I'm also painfully aware of very different makeup of our classes, different institutional settings, and, you know, how do you get particular students on board? And, you know, commitment to, in the first place, address these issues, or interest to address these issues, or to work through particular curriculum. Shruti Bala, in the article that maybe some of you have read that I sent around, Decolonizing Theatre and Performance Studies, she talked about, in particular, resistances of her white Dutch students to kind of challenging the relevance of particular materials she was putting on the syllabus. Why, you know, so disengagement issues. I think that's also one of the challenges beyond just, you know, how we address structural inequalities and who to reach out, but also how do we get this commitment and some kind of acknowledgement that we are implicated subjects, right, in these histories, inequalities, violence, and all of that.
Absolutely.
I think that's our ongoing challenge, I guess.
Maybe to begin with that discomfort and to start to recognize that the relationship of whiteness has established a discomfort and violence in their own experience as well. You know, there is a benefit to having us all be able to reach a stage of reparations. Yeah. I would love to hear from others. I know that I would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things. I think, you know, it kind of, the thread I'm kind of seeing, and it was kind of the question that I was trying to raise at the end of my reflection, which was the kind of Black Lives Matter movement in the UK context versus the kind of responses to, or analysing the impacts of the racially differentiated impact of COVID, seem to be pulling in slightly different directions. And I think it touches on what Valu also talked about, the sort of identity representation versus the kind of joining up the dots of like a wider, you know, racial, capitalist kind of globalized kind of structure. And how do we navigate that? And I think that also goes back to Priya's question about the different kind of racisms and how they vary across the world, within countries, and the different histories and contexts. And I think sometimes that conversation takes us away from thinking about this bigger picture. You know, race, or the construct of race, serves a function, and we are often kind of directed away from untangling that function and focusing on sort of issues about platform and representation, which are not unimportant, but it's like, you know, in the UK, the kind of performative response by a lot of, you know, liberals and organizations, it's almost now become part of their brand that they've got a Black Lives Matter. You know, what does that actually do? And then what other types of racism are being kind of elided in that situation, whether it's the prevent agenda, the counterterrorism agenda, whether it's kind of the hostile environment towards international students. So it's, I guess it's about keeping our eye on the ball and then working through that. And then how do we actually do that in practice?
Melodica had her hand up.
Yes,
yeah, I have unmuted myself, I guess. Yes. It's absolutely wonderful to listen to all the point of views and reflections. One, I was just wondering also with, you know, Siva Mohan Valluvan's arguments, and also with Naz's arguments also, is that when we start thinking about decolonizing academia or curriculum, somehow we are always thinking from the point of view of the global north. And precisely that needs to be challenged in a certain way, as he was pointing out, that when it comes to the post-colonial or the global south, the questions are very different in terms of what colonialism implies. So I guess there is a manner in which one can start thinking about decolonization outside the box from the way the global north is trying to kind of, through one way of inclusion, post-colonial theorists, of course, being included in the way histories or other disciplines are being written. And of course, inclusive, from my personal experience, I know that the British university I went to, because my research was on something Indian, the sociology department very politely told me that we don't do India. You can go to development studies because that's where India is done. So there are ways in which decolonization needs to be addressed within the academic structure itself, and patting ourselves on the back all the time that, we have scholars from the global south included, as we often do with the feminists, because the dissertation chapters often I read are, at the end, they have also the feminist reflections on them. So there's a manner in which this compensatory academia goes on and on. So I guess there's a way in which we need to rethink what we mean by decolonization.
Yeah, there's the choice between development studies or peace studies if things go the other way. Sylvia, are you going to?
Yes, thank you to all the speakers. I really a lot to think about. I think this kind of builds on what Malarika has said, but also from another angle. And I like to pick up on a couple of things which I hope will come together at some point quickly. Angela, you talked about this could be a possibility for a political movement, and that it's not just about that and you mentioned the left, and that it needs rethinking from in terms of a social, in terms of a socio-political sense, what's going on and how we can maybe use this opportunity to go forward. So on the one hand, I feel this sense of immense possibility from what's unfolding. On the other hand, I have a fear of this, what Malarika is talking about and what Valu is talking about, Valu, when you talked about authenticity, for instance. And I very well understand this sort of as an immigrant, somebody with the accent, which is again not the same as being as race and privilege and stuff like that. But I understand that sort of casting you in a certain role. So you are there to provide diversity, you are there to provide the scholar of color to show how this institution or this department is actually diverse. There is a bit of a tokenistic or aspect to it, or a search for a kind of justifying, actually showing how anti-racist or how open or how internationalist institution is. So there is that dimension as well. And on the one hand, I feel that some of the discussions, at least here in the UK, have been bogged down with identity politics in a way that I must say I don't like, because they actually are diffusing the political potential of what's going on, in a sense that everybody is focusing how to decolonialize their institution, how do we show that we are anti-racist. So there is a lot on that. And in some of our reading was this article by Kenan Malik, and I read something else today saying that to fight anti-racism, you cannot fight it with psychotherapy, you cannot fight it with identity politics, you actually fight it with international solidarity, for example. So how do we actually avoid pitfalls of, because I'm afraid that going into identity politics without really addressing the social issues, I think this is going to be another lost battle. And I think, I'm afraid also that big rich universities are going to employ a lot of diversity officers, and we are going to be sent on a lot of trainings how to be proper. Instead of, maybe what about giving a few more scholarships to students of color? You know, wouldn't that be a better way of using resources to diversify, to dismantle privilege, rather than do this sort of like in Catholicism, when you buy this indulgence and then you are forgiven, whatever. So it's a little bit, so yes, that's my comment, question, and both optimism and fear. Optimism, again, that this might be a social movement. I listened to Cornel West in another webinar recently, and he talked about actually a possibility of international solidarity around different groups, indigenous groups you mentioned, but also Dalit groups he talked about, for example, tribal groups in India. I'm thinking of Roma as well in Eastern Europe. So our East European would say, oh, we are not racist because we don't have a colonial history. Of course, they're very racist. I mean, there is the treatment of Roma is sort of a textbook of institutional racism. So that's, I stop here. Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate that. I think we do have a common interest in ending United States military imperialism around the world. And I think that common goal is something that if we kept our all of our energy towards, that we could kind of bring that about in some way. I mean, we have here a moratorium on housing rents that has ended as of July. So now we're talking about, will the government pay out an additional subsidy that would allow us, you know, ultimately what we're finding is that everyone must have some kind of universal income in this moment. Will the United States do that? Will they continue to do that? Will we turn de facto into a more socialist society by being able to provide for people when they cannot go to work? But with this recent surge, we're looking at now the context of people actually being evicted from their houses as of September. So we're looking at, and I'm sure you have probably already mentioned this, about how it affects Black and Latinx people in this country percentage-wise with much more severe degree. So we are looking at the impossibility of sitting back. This is not there will be people on the streets. So that middle class buffer perhaps that may have existed within the United States is fundamentally changing right now. And that it is a kind of situation of which side are you on? And I think that that's a very powerful place to continue to build. So yeah, I fully hear what you're saying, Sylvia, because, you know, I can see it in the University of California. I can see these systems well at work. But I can also see these movements that do in fact see themselves and are political movements of the moment. People are staying on the streets. It is bringing up more than just, you know, inclusion with a few more things, and people are demanding that it not dwindle into more trainings. So where in policy it goes and the extent to which it can actually fundamentally change the democracy of this country or turn it into something similar to a democracy where it currently is not, is really crucial. Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Could I just say something? So I'm talking quite a lot, but I wanted to pick up on Sylvia's point about shouldn't we be offering scholarships? And, you know, I think we have to be reflexive, and we're in the university. They are privileged spaces. We should be doing more for the kind of precariously employed cleaners working in our universities. And I think somehow, even though I work on the sort of awarding gap within the university, I do kind of think this isn't where the problem starts. The problem starts well before that. And, you know, should we only just be doing the work that we do in the spaces we're in, or how do we expand the work we do? And actually, by doing the work we do in universities, are we not just reproducing a system which, you know, people who make it then go on to, you know, reinforce the existing kind of power structures? So I think that's my worry about the work that I do in universities on this.
Oh, Supraja, were you going to?
Right. I actually logged in a little late, but of what I've been able to understand from the conversation thus far, I mean, it's extremely interesting and honestly deeply concerning that during this time that we're in right now, within the social location that I'm at, which is Bangalore, which is towards the southern part of India, I've been working with a community of trans people who have been trying to find home and funding for them during this point of time, and a lot of that has thrown up questions regarding my own research into queer and trans feminism, particularly towards this space. So the whole discourse of race and of the colonial intermingling with that of caste within the nexus of the Jogati or the the dedicated woman or trans person to a particular deity in this part of the land is extremely prevalent still in such a form that is in a sense reflective of what Sylvia brought up before of the Equality Labs talk that Cornel West and Chandrasekhar Azad were speaking of, where you see that the concept of hair, the concept of magical hair as dirt, which was, I think, a paper that Lucinda Rand.
Did we lose Supraja? It looks like it.
Is she back?
I don't see her.
She's there, but her screen's frozen.
Uh-huh.
I got locked out.
Yeah.
The internet, yes. We're in third world, yeah. Where, till what point were all of y'all with me?
You were saying that about the deities and
right. So the only sense of livelihood or the only sense of income that is possibly present for trans women or of trans persons right now is either through sex work or it's through a sense of the religious. And there's been work by Lucinda Randberg that looks at magical hair as dirt and how she uses the same sort of structure of understanding how the Karnataka government has moved towards cleansing these women of their matted hair as a sense of controlling their sexuality and bringing that back into the normative. But it is still, it still fails in a lot of its own conceptualization, because if you look at Jessica Hinchey again, and she speaks of the Hijra, she has a wonderful book where she maps out the laws and the legality that prevailed during colonial times here regarding the Hijra and how they created or triggered a sort of moral panic for the British because of their bodies, their kinship, their structures of movement and their performance customs, which were ineligible to the British during that time. And how all of that has more or less, it is the inheritance of that past that we're seeing today with the trans bill that was passed last year. It is the same inheritance that we're seeing of the Trans Protection Act, which completely removes any sense of self-determination, which removes any sense of humanization per se of the trans body. And so it gets extremely complicated, as Pia Ma'am had said, of looking at how race operates within different factions of the third world or the global south. And of what I can say of my experience within the central universities, I mean, there is hardly an awareness of the social structures that we walk into, and the ones that we create, our social locations. And I think performance in theater kind of makes that all the more visceral, all the more ocular, and it grants a sense of visuality, at least in this space, that isn't necessarily acknowledged otherwise.
Thank you for that. I'm not sure where would we like to take it further. I mean, in this conversation. I was going to ask again about this disciplinary embeddedness of these particular issues, if colleagues, again, Val or anybody else on the panel would like to comment on how to, in terms of pedagogy, how to move things forward. I think Angela gave us kind of a vivid example of her challenges or tactics. But what are the challenges for you in your particular institutional settings? I think these dialogues are good to have in terms of sharing resources, strategies, ways of, because these are big challenges on so many fronts, institutional, classroom, and classroom constituencies wise and otherwise.
Well, what I would like to say is actually trying to pool some of the other remarks, particularly when profiling the Indian context. I think what we sense there, a crude impression emerges that what we're not very good at is understanding the nimbleness and particularities of how racisms get co-articulated locally and with particular histories. And this goes back to an overarching question or theme that has arisen here, is that one of the great things about the American archive is that we also have its Freedom Dreams archive. And it circulates extraordinarily well as a kind of potent anti-racist register. But that is also a flattening register. And we get lost when we're trying to think through those frames. And we only sense all that lingers are a series of frustrations. I think Naja has done that very well today by talking about, in our news cycle, it has become very hard to see the actually extraordinarily disproportionate visibility of the Bangladeshi populations as regards particularly COVID-19 effects. And those COVID-19 effects as co-articulated by, in one instance, class and housing, and in another instance, citizenship and labor in the Leicester case. But there were Asian women, they weren't generally Bangladeshi, were they, Naj?
I think they were Indian.
All right.
In Leicester, yeah. They weren't
in Leicester, that's right. Yeah. But nonetheless, sometimes the American, and then when we try to make it travel to India, or for instance, when I remarked briefly on Sri Lanka, the references, I sense we kind of get, something becomes unintelligible. And I would like to stay with Stuart Hall's counsel about race as a floating signifier. And racism as a palimpsest on particular histories, but also race as in contiguous relationship to notions of ethnicity and nation, and how that gets purposed by local authoritarianisms. I don't think, the question just mentioned a very haunting context of trans rights in Bangalore, from what I understood. But we have to start there with the colonial modernity that Hindutva or a certain kind of Indian centralized nationalism has inherited and put into play. So what I find, for instance, on a pedagogical question is, when I teach my post-colonial theory courses and kind of race politics courses, I first establish the parameters. Yes, we all share the same concerns, ideally, or I would like to implore you to share these concerns. But then it's to start thinking beyond, like, how are we ourselves invested in these frames? one of the ironies, and I think the person who mentioned the global north issue is, one of the ironies is that sometimes the way we teach race and post-colonialism in the north is precisely what the reactionary nationalisms do in the global south. There is a strange affinity in the terms by which they narrate the world and narrate an understanding of identity, culture, legacy. And it beggars belief that sometimes we can't see that incredibly fatal symmetry. And I think in part, it's less about what we can do for others in the classroom, it's what we ought to interrogate ourselves about. What are the themes that are too convenient to communicate in a particular way? Similarly, when we become too reliant on the American race frame precisely because of its preponderance and prominence, not to deny it, and all of our kind of core legacies still, source America in very, very productive ways, but there has to be important translation work, and it's often difficult translation work. Thank you, sorry.
I agree, this is extremely important. And I think in the US, it is only an emergent understanding right now, and probably easiest to see as a function of institutional profile and, on occasion, disciplinary difference. Because one of the questions that becomes important now for an institution like the University of New York, where the vast majority of students are working class immigrants, their idea of education is deeply embedded in the possibility or the promise of some fantasy America in which everybody gets to have mobility. And so now that we are physically unable to provide a location for that to happen, we are simultaneously thinking, also because a lot of the protests were in New York, we're having to think about what it means to get higher education in New York City, what the housing situation is for any of the students, that a lot of the authority that the faculty derive from their location in the institution is sort of questionable now, or that even if we wanted to promise economic mobility and employment, or providing the skills that we just can't, it's not there to be had. So it's a very interesting moment in which we are sort of reconfiguring what it is that we do in class, and at the very pragmatic level, we're supposed to submit some survey about whether we want asynchronous or synchronous or mixed kind of modality, because we can't know that anyone's available to sort of sit in a room on their own and have silence. Like what kinds of conditions exist, we have no idea. And the institution certainly cannot help the housing situation. So it's a very interesting moment, and I'm involved here in my official appointment is in the English department, but I teach a lot in the gender studies, and which is a program and doesn't appoint people, and in the honors program, which also tries by recruitment to sort of modify histories of exclusion from higher education. But it's hard to say what these institutions are about anymore, because whatever fantasy mission we were on isn't available. It's unaffordable. The students aren't physically available. They don't see the point. Our enrollments are down 30%. So we'll see how it goes.
Sylvia, you have your hand up.
Yes, I just listening to what has been said, especially to Valu's point about some kind of cultural translation that we need, and also the example that Supraja brought up, that it's not only intercultural understanding of this matter, but that there is also a question of intracultural understanding, and that perhaps.
I think Sylvia's connection froze.
But it's a great thinking pause.
It's a good.
Really
it just looked like she was in a deep thought.
Oh, did I froze?
Yeah, you did.
Yeah, you did.
Oh, okay.
So maybe just to recap.
Where from? Okay,
you go to intracultural.
I
You've
just
got to
wanted
the
to say
saying that. Yeah.
I didn't think of these of these questions as through translation, but I think that's sort of that idea of cross-cultural, if cross-culture is an adequate term, but also it is within cultures itself. Within sort of bigger, so especially like India and places like that are very sort of diverse. How do we translate actually both the struggle and the issues, and that sometimes we are doing too much of a direct translation, and I'm trying to sort of in the discourses that have emerged from the murder of George Floyd on, I'm trying to kind of see how do I where is the position from which I could speak in a way that's appropriate, that's correct, that's right. And so I'm thinking, okay, I'm white. But then again, I'm from, it's not about me, just to kind of trying to understand, where this all, how this all maps. And then I'm thinking, okay, but this is not, I don't come from a colonial history. However, I'm in an institution that is very prevalently white in its managerial structure, at least. And when you look at staff, majority of employed staff. So I benefited from it. And then when I trace, okay, that my privilege, I find that this privilege coming from a former socialist country was not because I went to private schools or I came from a middle class, but it was a privilege that Oля and Milja would understand. It's a privilege of socialism. It's a privilege of schools being free, universities being free. So that's where sort of my privilege is rooted. So it's not a racial privilege, it was a privilege of socialism. And I think a lot of what we were talking about comes back to another old related question, is a question of class and class inequality. So I don't know, I'm just wondering how, I just feel that we need to think of different contexts and how the cause that is perhaps a common cause in a way maps in different contexts, and how can we speak from and for these different contexts, if it makes any sense. Hope.
Thank you, Sylvia. That's a great question. I'm aware that we ran over very much, and I promised Olivera that we would finish in 1 hour and 45 at least, because she's hosting us. But in closing, if I may ask the speakers to perhaps address one issue that did not get addressed in the brief or in this conversation that they think it's worth addressing and putting on the map for some kind of future conversations or for us to think about collectively, in no particular order, if this is a relatively clear question. So it could be an example, it could be a provocation, it could be a question.
I'm happy to go first. I mean, just because I think some aspects of our news cycle, we kind of forget what's most imminent. I think in one way, when we have to think about decolonization, is that the powers that be, let's put it like this, liberal modernity rehearses its own form of critique. It's comfortable with a certain form of critique. And I think it's happy to fold us into a safe space from within the university. But parallel to that, I think it would be remiss to neglect the absolute force of the populist right now and the kind of war it is agitating for in terms of the university question. And there are 3 or 4 different inflections of that cultural battle that they're readying for. In one instance, it works in a very symbolic form. We all know that the current populist right prefers the proverbial culture wars. It wants to foreground its preferred symbolic fault lines that act as shibboleths of national identity. And in Britain, we call him the Walkington man, but this kind of provincial subject that is seen as the Ur of the national entity. And the way in which the university has been readied, particularly the humanities, and just yesterday or a couple of days prior, we've seen them genuinely try to upgrade the kind of ways in which they can withhold funding from the universities, withhold funding on the university on the basis that we're not platforming a balanced cast of views and so on. So in one way, we will be accommodated, but it will be on the terms of an extraordinary populist framework and racialized and nationalist framework which works to their agenda fundamentally. The second thing is it has nothing to do with us. It is about how it wants to squeeze student space. So one thing we haven't talked about from the British perspective is how increasingly difficult kind of pro-Palestine solidarity movements and so on campus space, and how that has been weaponized as a key fault line, again, which acts as a proxy for the kind of bigger conservative fault line about who belongs, who is the appropriate subject, who isn't. And these things are really going to escalate in quite a dramatic way. And I think in some ways, I don't mean to say we are complicit as such, but I think the very fact that sometimes we can speak at length, but without really grasping what is the most imminent challenge that the current governmental frame poses. And I myself, we worry a great deal. And unfortunately, we all have stories about colleagues and so on who are suddenly finding it a little more difficult than just even a few years ago in terms of how they can profile certain themes. And in some ways, there is a polite version of profiling these themes, but the minute it is challenging, it's getting squeezed in a very radical way.
Thank you, Valu.
Yeah. Can I follow Valu just because it's talking about the UK context? So Valu made the point I wanted to make about the funding, but just to kind of add to that, like I think there's a narrow sort of liberal focus on diversifying and inclusivity without actually getting to the nitty-gritty of border controls, or, you know, the irony of the academic freedom debate is that the prevent agenda, which is about policing, whether it's activism around Palestine or whether it's querying Western military interventions around the world, you know, that is taboo. That is seen as potentially leading to, you know, extremism. Equally, that same freedom of debate, academic freedom, is also being used to promote transphobia. I mean, that's also another fault line in the UK in terms of transphobia, and actually the people who claim to be being silenced are the transphobes, right? So that's another big debate, and there's kind of almost a close alliance between the transphobes and Islamophobes, actually. So I just wanted to kind of add to Valu's point about that, because I think, yeah, those are kind of the issues that we've got this conflict that we need to really, that's imminent, that we need to deal with.
Angela or Olivera?
Well, just to say that I think, you know, as we know from our world systems and we know from how colonialism and coloniality is operated, that it functions as a global economic force that exerts its violence in ways that we can see happen and proliferate across so many different national contexts. So I do think that there is something about taking up Black Lives Matter. I'm seeing where murals are being built and made and all around the world. And I think that has the potential to galvanize from Black leadership a kind of decolonial movement that it feels to me is a certain undeniable truth about just pulling together the histories that are unique to specific contexts, but about how coloniality has operated in those contexts. There is a kind of, in other words, a sort of deeper truth that I think many working class and people of color know. They live it. And so where to build from that and draw from that in a kind of dual power model, in a sense that won't have us completely reliant on the narratives or the structures and the impending threats that are coming at us from people who hold purse strings. And I realize that's really, really difficult, and that's going to require an intense amount of discipline on our side, but to just continue to articulate and make the case for the kinds of changes that are needed across these contexts. And that there really is a much larger populace that is behind this, and it's necessary for the sustenance of us and the continuation of our planet, you know, really finding those unifying themes to move us forward. I think that sense of urgency is important for us in justifying the work that we're doing. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Oля, we cannot hear you because you're muted if you're speaking. You're still muted.
Yes, I was muted and then my mouse lost connection and then it looked lost. I don't think I have to add anything particularly significant at this point. To this day, I feel like this is a great moment to observe how some of these categories of analysis that have been comfortable and seemingly disparate are sort of melting into each other, so that a lot of the racial analysis is becoming clearly class analysis that used to be impossible in this country. And now we can talk about it. And I am very interested at the institutional level in how the positions of faculty as the authorized, knowledgeable persons will have to change, because the racism of US institutions is sort of undeniable and clear, but there has been very little space for a conversation about how to say anything about it. The very possibility that you could talk about a North American educational institution as a colonial institution is fairly recent. And I think what Vala was saying about the sort of the thinning of the authority of the kind of historical narrative about the racial liberation in the context of the American or US political system, that is going to have to go away with the going away of the publicly funded higher education in the United States. Something's very interesting that's going on here that has to do with how students have figured out ways to work the institution, how they know where the powers are, how they used to come to us for a way to join the economic mobility, how they just can't do that anymore, and that we don't necessarily know what is going to happen. But I think the work of reconfiguring what higher education does here, to me, seems to be the work of people who are the faculty and who are willing to abandon their sort of models of teaching and of sort of allowing students to join them in their ranks of the knowledgeable and the economically powerful. Now we have come to the point where the faculty are sort of preserving their position because it's an economic position. It is a job. And I think that's going to be a critical element of our understanding of what is possible in terms of education and anti-racism.
Thank you, Olivera, and thank you all particular speakers for contributing today and for this rich conversation. So once again, many thanks to Angela Marino and Simovahan Valuvian and Naz Rashid and Olivera Jokic. And thank you all for listening. This was, as I said at the beginning, the last seminar in our series of Cultures of the Left and the Pandemics. I'm just wondering whether Sylvia or Bishnupriya or Amit, who also initiated this seminar series, want to have any closing remarks for this series or announcements to make. Sylvia, you're muted.
No, I feel I talked a lot because I was inspired with our speakers, so I jumped in and talked a lot. So maybe Amit and Pia, or Amit or Pia, yeah.
I thought we're just taking a break because, you know, for a lot of people, summer breaks are coming. And we will resume in September with Malarika curating a session. Anybody who wants to, please feel free. And another session with Elaine Ashton's new book. And she will be in discussion with Janelle. So we have two lined up. We have many ideas lined up, and we have to also sort of bring the publication together. So the project is on, and anybody who wants to, you know, contribute and come again, please feel free. And thank you very much. It was a wonderful session. Yeah.
Thank you, Olivera. Perhaps you can stop recording and we can still chat informally.
Thanks for having us, everyone. Very generous.
Amit, you want to say something?
No, nothing. Thank you so much. It was really fun. And even the series, it was very interesting to go through all of these topics. And I think it's even more important now with COVID. I think we had discussed this before, that we're all becoming more and more national, closed spaces, local, that we're actually being, really closing, or even our resistance is becoming more international, and the hyper-nationalism that all of us are seeing everywhere. So it's actually to have these international exchanges, and we need to keep that international perspective would be really, really important and difficult also. But we need to struggle to do that in times to come, even if it is a pandemic. And I just wanted to say, thank you so much.